Welcome to the History in a Bottle podcast, the podcast that tries to take advanced, complicated subjects from history and make them a little bit more manageable. Now, this podcast is unscripted and only lightly edited, which means you might see me go on ranting and raving tangents. You might see me stumble over my words like I did a little bit there, or all that stuff. That's just kind of how it's being shot, amateurishly. Uh, you'll also see that this is done mostly in one take, although there have been a number of mishaps in the past. I've tried recording this particular episode twice, to no avail, so third time's the charm. So, just wanted to record this one real quick, just to give you a little bit of context. My iPhone is not very good at storing long videos, so it can only handle about 15 minutes of content at a time, so just be prepared for awkward cuts and random jumps, because my phone will occasionally just say, we don't have enough storage, so it'll just stop recording randomly. Yeah, like mid-sentence, maybe even mid-word, so just be prepared for that. I do what I can. With that being said, this particular episode, our first episode, will be the Battle of Lexington and Concord, also known as the beginning of the Boston Campaign, the start of the American Revolution, or the shot heard round the world. We'll be going over a little bit the background of it, and also just kind of like what its impact was, apart from obviously starting the wider American Revolution. We'll be going over the immediate aftermath and, of course, its wider impact on the war, on American politics, etc. So, without further ado, let's explore what exactly started the shot heard round the world and the American Revolution. Why did this come to pass? Well, really, it all starts with the 7 Years' War, or as we know it in America, the French and Indian War, which is more specifically the North American theater of that war. This was a massive war. It could be rightly considered to be a contender for the title of the First World War, as the fighting took place not only in Europe, between Britain and France and Prussia, modern-day Germany, and Russia, and Austria, but also it took place in India, in North America, obviously, and even there was some fighting in Africa on some of the coasts. I believe the Ivory Coast was a site of a few naval engagements. So, needless to say, this was a massive war, and it was an expensive war, and as a result of the war, Great Britain was in debt. They needed a way to pay off the debt, and most of the fighting was done in Europe, specifically in Germany. So America was, for the most part, untouched. Not only that, but Britain had been neglecting America. They had let it grow and prosper without taxing it very heavily. They did impose one tax, the 1733 molasses tax, which in general was not very successful. They didn't really enforce it, and they weren't making too much money off of it. Seeking to rectify this, they passed the 1764 Stamp Act, Sugar Act, and the 1765 Stamp Act, in an attempt to make money off the colonists. However, the colonists were upset. Why? Because this was being passed by Parliament, the legislative assembly of Great Britain. However, these colonists, who were British citizens, didn't have any seats in Parliament. In other words, they weren't represented whatsoever by Parliament. That meant that they were having these new taxes levied against them without any say as to how great these taxes were going to be, what the taxes would be used for, or even what kind of things would be taxed. It would essentially be like if you started getting, if the American government, you live in the fictional land of Coloniatopia or something, which has no seats in Congress, no seats in the House of Representatives or the Senate. It has only its basic governance, which is ultimately derived in its authority by America, and you start getting taxed. Your money is basically taken away from you to be used by the government for, whatever purposes. And all you can really do is just kind of complain about it because, you have no other thing you can do about it. However, the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act would eventually be repealed due to just the number of complaints. They were quickly followed up by the Townshend Act, which was repealed around the time of the Boston Massacre, which only further caused heated tensions between the colonists and the mainland British forces and loyalists in Massachusetts. And then you got all of the Townshend Acts except for the tax on tea, which would eventually be repealed following the Boston Tea Party. This was followed by the Intolerable Acts, which basically turned Massachusetts into a militarily occupied region. It was under the direct military occupation of the British Crown. That it was led by the Governor General Thomas Gage, and this caused no shortage of anger between the colonists and those loyal to the crown, the soldiers, loyalists. There were the Whigs and the Tories. Whigs were Patriots, as we would call them today. The Tories were more loyal to the crown. And the colonists began arming themselves. There were, I believe, let me pull out my notes here. Yes, there was a conflict known as the Powder Alarms, which was basically British forces went out to try and search and seize weapons. These would be not just hunting equipment, but actual weapons of war, including cannons. And for the most part, the Americans were successful in evading British authorities from taking their weapons from them, but needless to say, things were very much heating up in Massachusetts. Really, Boston was the only place where the British government had actual control. So the British Parliament sent the following letter to the king in February of 1775. That was about two whole months before April 19th, which is when Lexington and Concord, when the actual fighting began. So it was 2 months beforehand. The following letter reads, "We find that a part of your Majesty's subjects in the province of Massachusetts Bay have proceeded so far to resist the authority of the Supreme Legislature, that a rebellion at this time actually exists within the said province, and we see, with the utmost concern, that they have been countenanced and encouraged by unlawful combinations and engagements entered into by your Majesty's subjects in several of the other colonies, to the injury and oppression of a great many of their innocent fellow subjects, resident within the kingdom of Great Britain and the rest of your Majesty's domains. We shall pay attention and regard to any real grievances laid before us, and whenever any of the colonies shall make a proper application to us, we shall be ready to afford them every just and reasonable indulgence. At the same time, we beseech your Majesty that you will enforce due obedience to the laws and authority of the Supreme Legislature, and it is our fixed resolution, at the hazard of our own lives and properties, to stand by your Majesty against all rebellious attempts in the maintenance of the just rights of your Majesty and the two houses of Parliament. Essentially, everyone could see that stuff was going to go down in Massachusetts, to put it in layman's terms. So the real question was not if, but when and where. And obviously, could this be avoided? Both sides thought that if this was going to turn into a conflict, it would end rather shortly, probably with a compromise. But as we obviously know, that didn't happen, and we'll get into that in the aftermath of the battles at Lexington and Concord. On April 14th, 1775, Gage was ordered by the Secretary of State to disarm the rebels. Again, this had happened 4 or 5 times previously during the powder alarms, so nobody really expected this to be like the straw that broke the camel's back. So, Gage was basically given complete autonomy to do this however he saw fit. How he decided to do that was he was told by a spy to basically act now, to seize the weapons as quickly as humanly possible, because said spy was under the impression that the Continentals were about to take up arms and attack Boston, which was not true. On the 18th, the day before the actual battle, he started sending out patrols and issuing orders, basically saying, we're going to go seize the powder and weapons, which that was obviously taken up, and that's how the famous ride of Paul Revere and Dawes of Paul Revere, Joseph Warren, and William Dawes. That's how they were. So it was as a result of these orders that Gage issued on April 18th that allowed for the famous midnight ride of Paul Revere, Joseph Warren, and William Dawes. I could further elaborate on that. However, for brevity's sake, we'll just say that Dawes was captured. Dawes or Warren. I believe Dawes and that's right. So of course, Dawes and Revere's warning were sufficient, or sorry, Warren and Revere's warning were sufficient enough to gather a large militia contingent on Lexington Green, who were there awaiting the British regular force that had marched from Boston the night before. and met them on the green at approximately, I want to say, about 6:30 or so. At about 6:30 or so at in the morning. So the soldiers on both sides consisted of, mainly on the British side, it was the grenadiers and light infantry of the following regiments: the 4th King's Own Regiment of Foot, the 5th Regiment of Foot, the 10th Regiment of Foot, the 18th Royal Irish Regiment of Foot, the 23rd Royal Welsh Fusiliers Regiment of Foot, the 38th Regiment of Foot, the 43rd Regiment of Foot, the 47th Regiment of Foot, the 52nd Regiment of Foot, the 59th Regiment of Foot, the 1st Battalion of the Royal Marines. Of course, the Continentals were organized by town militias. At Lexington, it was mostly just Lexington troops, but by the end of the day, it was most of the towns in Middlesex County had arrived at Concord and had begun harassing the British on their retreat back to Boston. So, at Lexington, there were about 80 militiamen on the green, and in Buckman's Tavern, a small little establishment near to the green. It's still there if you ever visit, led by Captain John Parker. They, of course, met with the British and exchanged a few words, basically saying the British told them to return to their homes, to which they responded that the British should return to Boston. Obviously, neither side actively ordered to fire on the other. So the famous shot heard around the world was a complete either accident or deliberate breach of the orders of either side. As Captain John Parker says, I ordered our militia to meet on the common in said Lexington to consult what to do, and concluded not to be discovered, nor meddle or make with said regular troops if they should approach, unless they should insult or molest us. And upon their sudden approach, I immediately ordered our militia to disperse and not to fire. Immediately said troops made their appearance and rushed furiously, fired upon and killed 8 of our party without receiving any provocation therefore from us. Obviously, the validity of his statement is somewhat in doubt, as it is actually believed that the famous shot heard round the world was fired from Buckman's Tavern, and thus being fired from the militia into the regulars. There are, here is Lieutenant John Barker from the 4th Regiment of Foot, who says, at 5 o'clock we arrived in Lexington and saw a number of people. I believe between 200 and 300 formed in a common in the middle of town. We still continued advancing, keeping prepared against an attack, though without intending to attack them. But upon our coming near them, they fired up on us 2 shots, upon which our men, without any orders, rushed upon them, fired, and put them to flight. Several of them were killed. We could not tell how many, because they were behind walls and into the woods. We had a man of the 10th Light Infantry wounded, but nobody else was hurt. We then formed on the common, but with some difficulty. The men were so wild they could hear no orders. We waited a considerable time there, and at length proceeded on our way to Concord. So, in essence, what happened here was a complete breakdown of communication and the chain of command. It appears that one or perhaps several of the militia fired upon the British troops without orders, and British troops, in retaliation, charged the militia that they could see, firing and advancing with bayonets, forcing them off of the green. This obviously was a disaster from either side, with the British in particular being, viewing this as a complete failure of firstly, the men who were acting without orders, the officers for not being able to control their men, and just a complete breakdown of the system, and a total embarrassment. This was, of course, premeditated by the habitual harassment of the British troops by colonists. They were insulted, heckled, harassed. It was one such incident which led to the famous Boston Massacre, where a lone British guard was attacked by a mob of colonists. Such incidents were, of course, common. There was even a reported incident where a British soldier was murdered and dumped in a river, which was just put up to him being drunk and stumbling, hitting his head and falling into the river, so as to not cause any panic and or point unwarranted blame, as they couldn't actually find who murdered him. But in general, let's just say that the colonists had been very unwelcoming towards the British soldiers, who, cold, wet, and tired from having it rained the previous night, and they had to march the entire night from about midnight to 6:45, which is when the battle began. So, needless to say, once they started hearing gunshots, any concept of the chain of command was immediately dashed in their mind, and all they knew was that they finally had the excuse they had so long wished for to kill these people. Now, of course, they marched through to Concord, as that was their original end destination, and they began their search for supplies. They searched Barrett's farm, and they ended up finding they ended up finding three 24-pound cannons. However, they could not take with them the cannons, so they just had to try and disable the cannons, which would eventually be repaired and used in the Siege of Boston. And for the most part, though, their search was mostly unsuccessful. Most of the weapons and supplies were already pulled out, as, like I said, the Americans knew, or the Minutemen knew that the British were coming. So they obviously they started burning the gun carriages, which are the like sort of it's what the cannons are mounted on in order to be able to more easily move and aim them, which caused smoke. The soldiers under one Colonel Barrett, who was leading the Concord militia, he saw the smoke rising out and believed that the British were burning the town. So they tried to surge across the North Bridge. The North Bridge was being held by soldiers from the 4th Regiment and the 10th Regiment, and they began tearing up the bridge. The Colonel Barrett, Lieutenant Colonel John Robinson of Westford, and Captain Isaac Davis from Acton began an assault on the bridge, attacking the men who were trying to basically tear up the bridge in order to stop the Minutemen from advancing across the bridge to the town center. The regulars were forced back and away from the from the bridge and began the retreat from Boston there. On the return to Lexington, they were further harassed at Brooks Hill, at the Bloody Angle, which was closer to Lincoln, and there was significant fighting at Menominee, which is now known as Metonomy, which is now known as Arlington. A brigade was sent out from Boston under the command of Captain Percy, which included men of the so the entire column that was sent out from Boston to begin with was grenadiers and light infantry, which were more suited for attacking fortified positions and skirmishing in the woods, respectively. The relief column was a mixture of artillery from the Royal Artillery and battalion troops, the standard infantry wearing tricorns, as we commonly picture them, from a mixture of the 4th Regiment of Foot, the 10th Regiment of Foot, and the 47th Regiment of Foot. So there was fighting at Percy's column was in Lexington. It was not in it was not in Menominee, which is now Arlington. They fought at a place called the Jason Russell House, and generally there was interspersed fighting, but nothing quite to the scale of Lexington and Concord proper. And the fighting at Lexington and Concord signaled the beginning of open rebellion and the beginning of the American Revolutionary War. So the aftermath is generally that it was the beginning of the so-called Boston Campaign. Boston was put under siege until eventually the British pulled out in, I believe it was June of 1775. obviously, it also started the, or no, I'm sorry, of 1776, I believe. It was June of 76. But um, uh, it was soon after, um, in June of 1775, that the famous Battle of Bunker Hill would happen. And um, this signaled the beginning of not only the Boston Campaign, but also the wider American Revolution. Shortly after, um, uh, Thomas Gage, the Governor General of Massachusetts, was replaced with William Howe, and uh, the um, the yeah. So that was the beginning of the American Revolution. Um, Battles at Lexington and Concord. Our next episode should be going up around next week, hopefully on Friday. Uh, I'm sorry if I sound a little tired or if I stumbled over my words too much. This is a learning process. I'm trying to figure out how to, you know, research, film, and edit these things kind of all together. So I can't speak to the quality of the end result, but hopefully it turns out better than I think it'll turn out. But chances are it probably won't. So just bear with me. Hopefully my content will get better over time. But until then, this is Parker Gillett for History in a Bottle. Thank you very much.